Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Getting Started with Salesforce Wear Developer Pack for Apple Watch. My name's Quinton Wall. I work here at Salesforce in the Developer Relations team. I've probably spoken to a bunch of you people before in the past, but I'm super excited to go through our latest Wear Developer Pack and really get us all hands-on on using some of the new technology, in particular Apple Watch and Swift, Apple's new development language. So we've got a lot to go into. We'll go through just a few bits of housekeeping first, and then we're going to jump right into some code. So if you're interested in engaging with us on social media channels and keeping the conversation going, you can do it via all your favorite feeds: Facebook, Google+, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, and of course this webinar will be recorded, so you can always access the information at the same URL that you registered with as well. And we're also including a whole bunch of additional information and material, including the code that we go through and build inside here. We do have a lot of information to cover in this webinar. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them in the questions and answer screen as we go through. We will try and get to as many questions as we can. Those that we don't answer during the webinar, we'll definitely try and follow up afterwards with an FAQ and, as I said, additional information like training and tutorials, and in particular Trailhead modules. So if you haven't done Trailhead, make sure you check that out, because we'll be adding some more mobile SDK related and Apple Watch related trails in the near future. But of course, if you've joined any of our webinars before, you've seen something similar to our Safe Harbor slide. I won't go into too much detail here, but the main point is make sure you base any buying decisions on public available features and products. The good thing is everything that we're doing in this webinar is publicly available as open source, the mobile SDK and the new developer pack, but things do change, so it's always good to keep in mind and base your buying decisions on publicly available features. So why are we here? We've all probably seen the announcement just recently from Apple and their Apple Watch. It's hitting the stores next month, so I'm eagerly awaiting it like many other people around the world. But we looked at the wearables kind of revolution over the past year, maybe a little bit more as well, in terms of how do we enable developers in particular to build these next generation apps connecting to all sorts of wearable devices, not just the Apple Watch. So things like Android Wear, Google Glass, Mio, a whole bunch of other providers out there. And we launched what we called our Salesforce Wear initiative last year. The Apple Watch Developer Pack that we just launched is the latest in that Wear initiative. And it provides a few things. It provides a reference application, and the application itself is a pretty simple application that I'll show you in just a moment, but it's for managing approvals, effectively any information and data that comes out of Salesforce. We're going to extend that application during this webinar. It also includes some pre-configured projects. If you've done any work in Xcode before, you need to understand the notion of projects and targets. So with Apple Watch, it's even more important because you are actually deploying to slightly different targets. And the last thing that we tried to focus on is typical common patterns that you will see when you're developing a Apple Watch application, in particular how you handle messaging and working with the Salesforce mobile SDK for iOS. So I think that's enough slides for now. I'm going to jump in and I'm going to show you a little bit of a demo on what the Apple Watch Developer Pack starts as, and then we're going to extend that, as I mentioned. If you're new to Xcode, what you're seeing here is what we call a storyboard. So a storyboard gives us the ability to very graphically lay out our interactions and flow of our application. So we're actually looking at our approval app here in a storyboard. I can see from my glance, and I'll explain some of these terms in just a minute, that I'm going to have kind of a starting point. So if you think of kind of like the lock screen on your phone, this is the starting point for your application, which will flow into a list of information, in our instance, approvals, and then finally the details. What can I do with those details? Can I make it action oriented? So let's go ahead and run this one and let's see what it looks like. Just give it a moment to kick off, and my simulator will pop up in a minute. So here we go. You can see here on this screen, right in the middle of the screen, this is what we call a glance. A glance has the ability that is very read-only. In our instance, we're showing the number of approvals. So if you see here, I have 3 approvals waiting, 2 pending, and none rejected. I need to work on those rejected skills a little bit more. So I'm going to click on this, glance, drill into it, retrieve a list of approved opportunities or pending opportunities directly out of Salesforce, and then I can very quickly drill into each one of those and see some more information. Of course, I'm not a designer. I could probably do a better job at design, and we'll work on that a little bit in our tutorial. But the one thing that you'll notice here is this app is running what looks like by itself, but the reality is it's actually connected to my phone application. So in the sample application and the dev pack, all that the phone application does is provide authentication and messaging. One thing that you'll realize once you get more and more into Apple Watch development, the watch is really an extension to the phone. So keep that in mind. So that's our sample application. I'm going to explain just a little bit more detail about what we actually saw there, and then we're going to spend the rest of the time actually extending that app. The first thing that you need to realize is what we showed you there is kind of three aspects, and these are the parts that you really need to get started. If you're brand new to Xcode development, iOS, or Apple Watch, you really need three things when you're working with Apple Watch and the Salesforce platform. The Apple Watch Developer Pack, and you can get that from developer.salesforce.com/wear. You need a recent version of Xcode. The latest public version is 6.2. If you do download a beta version, 6.3, there's actually a bug in there that affects the login screen. So for now, stick specifically to 6.2. And there's some reason behind that as well, in particular the updating of the Swift language, which all of our development will be done in here. And the last thing that's optional is an Apple Developer Membership. It's something like $99 a year. It's not required anymore. You can access Xcode free from the App Store and download it. But if you do want to deploy applications onto a physical device, you will need a paid membership. Generally, I strongly encourage people to join the membership. You get access to the beta products and information before anybody else. As a developer, that's what we love. But what did we actually see when we went through that before? As I mentioned, there's a few areas where just a quick level set on terminology and a primer of what you're looking at helps a lot. And this will help us when we jump into the second part of the webinar, which is really getting hands-on and building things. First and foremost that I mentioned, a watch app is an extension to a phone application. In other words, you can't have a watch app without the phone. That's just the way it works. That's the way Apple's designed it. And it's very important to realize that as you develop your watch applications, don't try them shrunken down versions of phone applications. Apple provides a nice feature called handoff, which allows you to kind of hand off from the watch back to the phone, just like you might be reading a web page on your iPad, then handing off back to your desktop. So that's a very important design principle. The second part is, if you've done any Xcode development, the development model is pretty well the same. You use storyboards, you use controllers, and add your logic to those backend controllers. There's just a little bit of difference in terms of how you actually deploy your application and build it. And finally, the last thing that you need is the mobile SDK that ties all of that together. What's important to realize and recognize is that with the mobile SDK and an Apple Watch, you're doing all the communication to Salesforce from the phone. The watch is actually connecting to the phone, not into Salesforce. So again, that's going to adjust how you design your applications, and the developer pack is specifically designed to handle some of that heavy lifting for you. Another quick level set before we kind of jump in a little bit more is some new terminology that you may not have been aware of. The first one is glances. You saw the glance, a very simple glance when I showed you that application, the kind of circular view. A glance is kind of a read-only immediate view that a user can kind of swipe and tap on to get information. It's really important to realize that that kind of launches your application. I like to think of it as notifications on your lock screen on your phone, if that helps you with kind of an analogy. I have to swipe to actually launch the application. It's the same as glances. Notifications is something that you will use quite a lot, and they're pretty well what you expect. A notification that may come from Salesforce to let you know you have some important information. You can add some buttons on there, but you can also have what they call long form notifications, which means I can scroll my notification and approve or reject. My experience is that you don't want to scroll more than about maybe 2 watch faces long, because that's a lot of information to go through on a notification. It may make sense to drill deeper into the app or even hand off straight back to the phone. And the last one that's worth understanding is there's a new gesture in the watch, and it's coming onto the new Mac lapbooks, the MacBooks as well, and it's called Force Touch. So the nice thing is Apple's decided to use our name here, so that'll help you remember what that is. But it's a new gesture that means you can hold down and kind of force the touch on a device and do some pretty interesting things. And we're going to take advantage of that in our application that we build. So let's have a quick run through again of the blueprints that you'll see in those developer packs, and then we're going to put those things into practice by actually building an extension to this application. As I mentioned, the very first thing that happens when you're building a wearable app is you're going to use the mobile SDK for iOS and log in using your credentials, in this instance for Salesforce, to connect via the phone. What will actually happen as part of that process is you will need to add what we call observers. It's an Apple technology or terminology that lets you effectively say, I want to listen for events and handle them. And those events in particular are going to be the watch notifications. Once I authenticate clearly and retrieve my token, I then have the ability to open up the watch and communicate with Salesforce. So in particular, let's say a glance opens up, the request goes back to the phone application and the mobile SDK, which sends the request to whatever the observer is that you've identified. We'll go through that in a little bit. We'll actually build an observer. That observer will then communicate to Salesforce, actually return that response all the way back via a mobile SDK call, and then hand that off to the Apple Watch. So it sounds kind of a complicated flow, but this process and this kind of blueprint and pattern is pretty consistent. There's a few different ways that you can do things. For instance, sending messages back and forth between the watch and the mobile SDK app running on the phone. We've implemented using observers and kind of callbacks. There's another option that you can choose called app groups. I prefer the callback approach that we have here. It fits well into the mobile SDK delegate model. So if you're like me, that's probably enough slides to keep you going for the day. So how about we actually jump in and build an application? I always find the best way to learn is by doing. Now for the next kind of 20 minutes or so, I'm going to build an extension to that watch app that we showed before using the Developer Wear Pack to build 3 tasks. One is extend the phone application to add what we'll call a handler and those observers. How do I manage the communications back to Salesforce? Then we'll also add some new UI and a little bit of logic on the watch. And then finally, we'll add that new gesture that I mentioned, Force Touch. And I've purposely made all of the code available on GitHub. You can see the URL right there. And there'll be a little bit of homework if you want to go and extend the rest of this application as well, just depending on time and how we go. Okay, well, let's start building our application here. What we want to do is extend from the developer pack, and in our instance, we're just going to add the ability to support retrieving tasks and then maybe adding an activity on them, such as canceling or rejecting or basically changing the status. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a new handler class. We're going to make this a Swift file. And we're going to call this one Tasks Handler. Now I've grabbed some code from a sample before, just so you didn't have to watch me copy and paste. But if we look at what's going on here, the most important thing that we want to look at is this getTasks function. So getTasks uses the mobile SDK and the standard REST APIs to retrieve information, in our instance tasks. So what we want to do is add a query right here. Now I like to build my queries separate from the code that I'm working on, and Salesforce provides a very cool little app that we like to call Workbench. I'm logged into Workbench here, and you can get there by going to workbench.developerforce.com. I'm going to create a query, and we know we want to build it on tasks, so let's find task. I'm going to select that guy, and now I have the ability to actually choose the fields that I want to get out, and it will dynamically create the query. So I know what I want, so I'm going to type in status, subject, and we probably want priority. From task, where is closed equals false. We don't want to see any closed tasks, and I probably want it nice and neat, so I'm going to order by last modified date. Let's just run that query and make sure it works. Great, so we see our results here. So I'm going to take this information here, I'm going to copy the query that I know is working now, I'm just going to paste it straight into my code here. The other part that's worth looking at in the code here is all of these kind of request response methods. These are the delegate methods or the handler methods that the mobile SDK requires you to implement if you tell Xcode that your code, and this class in particular, can handle Salesforce REST responses. So if we see here, I'm actually specifying that this class is of type SF REST delegate, so I can retrieve information and handle responses coming back. And I know that I'm doing that here for this particular instance because I'm saying send the request that I've just created, and I want to handle those responses myself. So you'll see here that once I get these responses back, I effectively unpack them and send them back to the watch. Now some of this watch info and the block information that you see here, that's all handled by the developer pack, so you don't have to do that heavy lifting. We've done that part for you. Okay, great. So now I have a nice little handler class. I'm going to jump over to my view controller. This is the view that you see behind the scenes that's starting up the watch app. If I look at the storyboard, it's this application here. It's this screen. It's not very exciting because it doesn't do anything from a UI perspective, but from the code behind the scenes, it actually lets us do quite a lot. So what we want to do here is we actually want to add the observers. So when a request comes from the watch, we know who is going to handle those. First thing that we want to do is we want to say tasks handler, our new tasks handler. Great. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to take advantage of some more copy and paste here, and I'm going to change this guy and add an additional observer for handling task list requests. Now observer is pretty well, if you're used to doing anything on iPhones where you swipe down to see the notification center when something comes in, this is exactly what we're doing here. The notification center says, let me register a class and an observer to actually handle the response and do something with it. So this is where we're pointing it right back to our approvers handler. But specifically here, we're saying this class will take care of it. Great, so we have that. Now what we want to do is set up our new handler. Make sure it knows how to. Now we want to set it up so it makes sure it knows how to add the watch info, and we'll specify. Again, the dev pack kind of takes care of a lot of this stuff for you. The last thing that I want to do is make sure we know how to handle that. Where should I send a request once the observer has heard about it? So I'm just going to copy and paste again, and I'm going to say task list. And then all I have to do is self.taskshandler.getTasks. So pretty similar pattern that you'll see when you're going through all of the applications to extend the sample application in the developer pack. We've done that intentionally to make it easy so you can focus on kind of building the new logic. OK. Okay, so now the last thing that we want to do, now that we've specified the watch information that we want to send, is we just want to add the support for actually doing our response to send to the delegate. So we're going to say else if notification name equals task list. We'll go into that a little bit more in a few minutes. I want to say self.tasks handler .get tasks. Perfect. Okay, now that we've got our watch information, the next thing that we want to do is add just a quick additional statement into our if statement here to actually do the request to get the tasks from our handler. So I'm going to add a new line here and say else if notification .name equals task list. We want our tasks handler to handle it. Get tasks. Okay, great. Now we have that up and going. Now what I've done is I've shown you how to add it to things like the view controller and add your handler. With inside the delegate class inside the sample application and the dev pack, we do some of the heavy lifting for you. So if I look at the new method that comes with WatchKit that you have to implement to handle that request and response, it's called handle WatchKit extension. We've kind of already got a nice little pattern here to handle any objects or information that come from the watch that have a request type parameter, and they will automatically get pushed to the notification center. So any of those observers that we've set on there will actually pick that up and route the response correctly. So just the code that we just added. So that's great. Now we have our phone application up and running. We've got it wired into Salesforce using the mobile SDK. The next thing that we want to do is we want to switch to a different target. And this target is our WatchKit app. So if you see down here, I've actually got separate projects within inside the one project, for lack of a better term, because as I said before, a WatchKit application or an Apple Watch app is bundled into the same application as the phone application. So if you went to the App Store to download this app, you would download one binary that installs the phone application with the extension to the WatchKit. So now what we want to do is we want to update our watch application. So let's go to our storyboards. We have our storyboards here for our basic approvals application that comes with the dev pack. We want to add a new view. So we're going to add a new interface controller. I'm going to call this guy tasks list. Call it task list. I'm going to specify that this is the controller that starts upon launch. So I click is initial controller, and you'll see the main arrow actually move to specify it visually which is the starting controller. So see here, this guy has now changed to say that this is the starting controller. Of course, we want to show a list of data. Let's go and drag a table and drop that onto the data. Okay, and because WatchKit's and Apple Watch development works exactly the same as a phone app, I have a view that I'm looking at here and also a controller to handle the logic. So we want to add that controller. I'm going to right click here and say new file, Swift file, task list controller. We're going to keep it really basic for now, and we'll come back to it in a minute. I'm going to import WatchKit libraries, class task list controller. And that's about it. I'm just going to double click on this guy. It's a little tricky on a smaller screen, but one of the great things that I can do is I can start working with my code behind in my controller as well as the interface. So I'm going to go back to my interface, and I need to tell the interface what is that code behind. So I'm going to click on here and specify which class it is. So let's go, make sure we've clicked the right guy. There's my task list controller. And apparently I've made a typo, so let's fix that. Let's fix this guy to be great. Now we're specified. Now, as I mentioned, these things aren't kind of wired up totally now. Our high-level controller is wired up, but our table isn't. So I'm going to go click on this table, right-click and drag into my class, and I'm going to connect the two together. I'm going to call this guy results table. And now I have a connection, or an outlet as it's called in iOS development. So that's great. Now I have the information, I have my table connected, I have my view connected. I'm going to add a little bit of code to handle the responses and populating the table. So let's just go grab that. Okay, I'm going to just drop a little bit of code in here to save me some typing, and then I'll go through and explain the information. So really what I've done is I've added the code into a will activate method. So whenever this class starts up or this interface is displayed, it's going to go and request the task list from the app and eventually the Salesforce platform. What I'm doing here is I'm creating a bundle of a request to go back to the phone to make that exchange of information with the request type of task list. If you remember, once we added the observers, the task list is kind of the key that we're looking for. And then I'm going to handle the response. Right now we're not going to do too much with the response, just print account, but we're going to add that information in just a moment. Okay, I'm going to save that guy. Now the last thing that I need to do to make this thing fully functional is we want to look at the row. If you remember, I added a table, and by default it comes with what's called a row controller, so I can specify how I want that row to actually look. So again, let's go create a backing file or a controller for that row. I'm going to call this guy something very creative like task row controller. And we're going to keep it pretty simple again. Import WatchKit, class task row controller. And the one value that I'm going to add in here is a record ID. So this is the Salesforce task record ID. It's going to be of type string. Great. So again, I'm going to double click on this guy because I want to drag those outlets from my interface. Okay, I'm going to jump back here. Now I'm going to make my row look a little bit more interesting. Let's say we add an image. We want an image to make this thing look good. Okay, I've dropped an image on here. I'm going to give it a few dimensions to make it look good. Left, maybe center it to the side. I know the size of my images, so I'm going to make it a fixed size by 24 by 24. Perfect. Now, of course, we need some images to go with it. So why don't we go add those? I'm going to click on my images .exe assets file. I like to keep things neat, so I'm going to create a little folder here. Call it priority. So we're going to have a little fun with our application, and depending on the priority of the tasks, we're going to specify some different images. So I have my images here. If it's a high priority, maybe we'll have a sad face. If it's low priority, we'll have a happy face, and something somewhere in the middle. So I'm just going to select these guys, drag and drop them into my little folder there for priority images, and have some nice funky images to go with my app. Okay, let's just jump back to our storyboard. I have my images done. That's great. I'm going to add a new control that comes with WatchKit and the Apple Watch. It's called a group. Group helps me lay out things just a little bit nicer. So in my group, I'm going to actually set my layout to be vertical because I want to add two images to it. Two text fields. The first text field I'm going to do, so I'm going to grab and drop that guy on there, and I'm going to call this guy status. This is going to handle the status of our task. Let's just change the font. Let's maybe give it 12 points and thin. Great. Let's add one more label for what we like to call. Let's add one more label for the subject. I'll call this subject. Okay, let's change our font again. Let's keep this thin, but we'll make it just a little different size. Done. Now that I've got my UI created, I just want to start dragging these things together into my outlets. But now that I have my UI created, I need to make sure that my table row has a specific backing file. So I'm going to call it task rows as an identifier, which is how we identify it in code. And I'm going to connect it to my task row controller. Now the code and the UI are connected. I can drag in my outlets. I'm going to call this guy priority image. Now I'm going to drag in my other guys here. I'll call this one status. I'm going to call this last guy subject. So now I have the hooks into my code where I can bind data very easily. And you know what? That's the last thing that we need to do, is bind that data. Let's jump back to our task list controller. That's where we're binding the data to our results table, if you remember. And what we want to do is we want to implement this load data. Paste this guy in here. Let's fix our error here. Copy and paste some code, put it in there. Great, we've fixed our error, we're good to go. So if you notice, I've specified the identifier of task rows. So whenever I receive data, I'm going to iterate and enumerate through that information, instantiating a task row controller each time, and then binding each of the values that come out of the results via the mobile SDK to the values in the fields that I set with my outlets: status, subject, record ID, priority image. So that's about it. Why don't we run our application and see how we're going. That looks great. We can see our information here right on the phone simulator. Drag up and down. Now, one last thing that we want to do is we want to implement the new Force Touch gesture that's provided in Apple Watch. This is amazingly simple to do, so let's go stop our simulator. Let's just jump back to the storyboard and let's drag a menu component right on top of here.
The menu component gives us a series of menu items as well. Let's go add a few of those. Drop another one in here. We're going to use this Force Touch functionality to implement a very quick status change functionality. Okay, let's start with the first one. Let's call this guy cancelled. And we'll put a nice little trash can. Let's go to the next one. Let's say in progress. Maybe we'll put a little play button. And the last, why don't we add one more, and let's say it's on hold. Now, as you see, I'm using the predefined images that come with Apple Watch and WatchKit, but of course you can add your own ones in there as well. So I'm going to say this one's on hold, so I'll say maybe. Let's run our app again and see where that gets us. Our app should pop up again here. And now let's say that I want this not started one to change the status. I just hold down and force press, and automatically I have this really nice looking menu system that I could then go and create and change those things. Of course, I haven't actually implemented the connecting to do that yet, but that's kind of homework for you guys. You just have to add the outlets and then of course send the request back via the Salesforce Wear Developer Pack and add the handler method. In fact, the handler method's already there, so you probably just need to add the observer. But that's homework for you guys. And that's it. We've updated our sample application with the ability to handle tasks, and we've done it all right inside Xcode within about 10 or 15 minutes.
To kind of bring it back and recap, make sure that we have enough time. We're early days in Apple Watch development. So the next thing that I'm going to start working on is a version 2 of the watch, which includes things like support for Swift 1.2 and analytics, as well as enhanced features on the phone. So effectively a full-featured app on the phone to show a little bit more information. So I'm going to wrap up with a few bits of information while I answer some of the questions on the Q&A, but specifically if you want more, we've provided a getting started guide on how to learn the developer pack. The URL is you get to. We've also started developing some enterprise iOS tutorials. There's a lot of tutorials out there on the web, but the intent of these tutorials is to look at Salesforce platform is kind of that very powerful mobile backend as a service, and how you can learn iOS and specifically Swift on how to extend and create enterprise applications, because they are different to consumer applications. And the last thing is the tasks app that I built during this webinar. I will create a step-by-step tutorial and share that with everybody as well, including all the code and the samples, and I promise you it does work if the simulator is behaving itself. So with that, I want to thank everybody for attending. I'm going to try and take the next kind of few minutes to answer some of the questions that we have. If we don't get to your questions and answers during here, we'll definitely make sure we respond to them via an FAQ afterwards. So the first question that I have is, will this work with a hybrid application? So it's a good question, but no, it won't, unless you potentially extend the Cordova plugin or the Cordova app. So if you're not familiar with a hybrid application, it's effectively a wrapper around a native app to the HTML code or maybe code in Visualforce or Lightning that's running inside there. Our mobile SDK supports hybrid apps, but I've never actually tried to extend that hybrid app to connect to the watch. If somebody tries it, be interesting to check it out, but I suspect you may have a few issues. Next question was, can you please let me know where to get the mobile SDK and Apple Watch library? So all of those are available on GitHub. Oops, that's not what we want. All of those are available on GitHub at developerforce.com, or you can go to developer.salesforce.com/wear and get all of the information from there. That includes the code and the samples, as well as all the other Wear developer packs for, like I said, for Android and Google Glass and so on. The last one is, can you please share with us which apps other Salesforce customers are building? The great thing is we're actually seeing a whole mix of apps across the kind of wearable landscape. And generally, the majority of use cases fall into the requirements to be hands-free for primarily safety reasons to start with. So we have some field service agents in oil fields, for instance, that need both hands-free to be able to work with certain devices or maybe fix and repair everything. The other first wave that we're seeing as well is a lot around notifications, although I do suspect notifications will be overused with Apple Watch and wearables to start with. They really should be action orientated and focused on adding immediate value. So for instance, the oil rig repair person that I mentioned before, they don't want to be notified with every single notification that comes through and annoyed with that, but they may need some kind of proximity warning if they're coming too close to a restricted area that may have dangerous pollutants or chemicals. So that's the kind of action-oriented notification that could then pop up, and then they proactively say, yes, I understand, or okay, I've got it, and kind of move back away. So there's a lot of them out there. I suspect that the first wave of apps will be trying to take a mobile phone and putting it onto a watch, which won't work. It should really be an extension to a phone or broader device. As I mentioned, Apple has that handoff functionality to take care of that. Next question was, when will Salesforce One app support watch integration? It's a great question. When we launched the Dev Pack, we also launched two other parts of the announcement. One was a Apple Watch app for our analytics cloud, and also a Salesforce One extension. That Salesforce One extension, again, Safe Harbor, is intended to be at the third quarter of this year and make it available, so roughly around Dreamforce time. The last questions were all, again, around please share code repository and information that's shared available. I'll make all of that available, but the best place to go right now is github.com/developerforce or developer.salesforce.com/wear, where you can get all of that information. But otherwise, grab it from this URL right here and you can start getting all the information. One last question that I think we have time for is, does Xcode development work with Windows? Short answer is, unfortunately, no, it does not. If you do want to build Xcode applications, you will need a Mac, and especially the later versions of Xcode, like 6 and above, need a pretty new version of the operating system. Good thing is OS X is now free, so it should be relatively easy as long as you have a Mac to update to the latest. Looks like we've got time for one more question. The question was, this is kind of only one directional, what I showed in the samples here. That's correct. So I'm making a request from the watch. It's going via the phone into the cloud and returning that information. So by being one directional, it's coming from the phone. Version 2 of the developer pack will include notifications. So notifications are natively supported on the Salesforce One platform already. And WatchKit and Apple Watch provides the notification framework. We just need to wire that up into the developer pack. So that's more kind of along the lines of push notifications. But in terms of the sample application, yes, the request is coming from the watch to the cloud, but the request is coming back as well. So that's about it for the webinar. I want to thank everybody for their time, and definitely look out on developer.salesforce.com for more information about Apple Watch and wearables. And if you haven't got your first badge on Trailhead, definitely go to developer.salesforce.com/trailhead and get started now. Okay, thanks everybody for attending.